On August 31st, 1997, Diana died in a tunnel in Paris. The whole world stopped. The Queen Mother didn't. While 1 million people piled flowers outside Kensington Palace and the country demanded the flag fly at half-mast, the Queen Mother was at Balmoral, and according to those who have documented that week with the most sustained attention, her response wasn't grief. This isn't a story about Diana's death. It's a story about one woman's reaction to it. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, was 97 years old in August 1997. She would live to 101. What she did, what she said, and what the available record shows she felt during the 7 days between August 31st and September 6th is the subject here. Understanding any of it requires understanding who she was before the phone rang. She was born on August 4th, 1900. Queen Victoria was still alive. By the time Diana died, the Queen Mother had lived through 2 world wars, the General Strike, the abdication crisis of 1936, her husband's death in 1952, the moon landing, the Falklands War, multiple IRA campaigns, and the slow dismantling of virtually everything that royal life had meant when she was young. Her husband, King George VI, died at 56, leaving her a widow for 50 years. For those 50 years, she had been the Queen Mother, the pink-hatted, wave-from-the-balcony figure credited with staying in London during the Blitz, with walking through bombed East End neighborhoods beside her husband and being photographed doing it, with holding the institution together through its worst 20th century crises by force of personal presence and unbreakable composure. By every available poll in the 1990s, she was the most beloved member of the royal family by a considerable margin. That popularity wasn't an accident. It was the product of a specific, deliberate, lifelong performance of a particular kind of royalty, one that academic sources on the period describe as combining informality with dignity, a belief in traditional values. One analyst of the monarchy has summarized her personal philosophy in a phrase that circulated in academic literature on the crisis as, "Never explain, never complain. Be a royal." She had navigated the abdication when her brother-in-law Edward VIII walked away from the throne for Wallis Simpson, forcing her husband onto it, by treating the damage as something to be managed and papered over, not acknowledged. She navigated the Blitz by making herself visible in the rubble. She navigated her husband's premature death by carrying on with a full public diary and a face that never once slipped. Diana represented something the Queen Mother understood as a threat, and had understood that way for years before August 31st, 1997. But to see the week of Diana's death clearly, you have to see the landscape it happened in first. At Balmoral, the Queen Mother kept her own separate residence, not the main castle, Birkhall, a smaller house on the estate set north of the River Muick, close enough for the family to see each other daily, separate enough to constitute a private world of its own. During the family's Scottish summers, the arrangement was standard: the Queen in the main castle, the Queen Mother at Birkhall, with mutual visits across the estate and days structured around the activities that Balmoral in August had always meant: the shooting parties on the heather moorland, the picnics in the hills, the walking of land that the family had owned since Prince Albert purchased it for Queen Victoria in 1852. Evenings at the castle ran to tartan carpets, kilts at dinner, and the specific domesticity of a family most completely itself when away from London and its obligations. She went to bed on the night of August 30th, a Saturday, in the usual way. The news came through to the main castle shortly after 1 in the morning. The night was quiet over Aberdeenshire. The Cairngorms were dark to the west. In the castle's tartan-carpeted corridors, the phones began. At that hour, the first reports were incomplete. A car crash in Paris, a tunnel under the Pont de l'Alma, Diana injured, the nature of the injury not yet established. Early dispatches suggested she had suffered a broken arm and walked away from the accident. Prince Charles was notified by phone. Andrew Morton, drawing on years of reporting from multiple sourced accounts and published in a 2022 Daily Mail piece, described the initial mood inside the castle as one of bewilderment and confusion. The Queen's first response to that incomplete initial information was recorded by Morton. What is she up to now? It was shaped by the uncertainty of those earliest minutes. No one yet knew what was happening, and can't be read as her settled view of events. As the situation clarified over the following 2 hours, the mood in the castle shifted from confusion to something harder to name. Charles wept, Morton wrote. He repeated, "What have we done to deserve this?" over and over, his thoughts running immediately toward how the world would apportion blame. "They're all going to blame me, aren't they?" he reportedly said to his private secretary, Stephen Lamport, in those early minutes. Lamport didn't soften the answer. "Yes, sir. I think it could." The Queen, Prince Philip, and Charles paced a corridor, tartan carpeted, in the way of all the private spaces at Balmoral. The Queen ordered a pot of tea. None of them touched it. Phone calls went out in multiple directions simultaneously. Diana's sisters, Lady Sarah McCorquodale and Lady Jane Fellows, were notified. Diana's mother, Frances Shand Kidd, was reached in the early hours at her home on the Scottish island of Sale, told that her daughter was dead, and then told not to tell anyone until the news had been officially announced. Author Jonathan Mayo's minute-by-minute reconstruction of the night, compiled from multiple sources for the 20th anniversary, records what happened next. Shand Kidd unpacked the suitcase she had begun to pack to visit Diana in hospital. She couldn't call a friend. She sat in her house on the island, and she watched BBC News in the dark, and she yelled at the television, "Come on! Come on! Tell the world!" At 3:20 in the morning, the Queen sat down and wrote a note. She didn't call Burkhall. This detail, preserved in Mayo's account, sits quietly in the record but carries weight. At 3:20 in the morning, with Diana confirmed dead, the Queen's mother asleep in a house down the road, the decision was made to write a piece of paper to be delivered when the old woman woke. Not a phone call in the middle of the night. A note. The reasoning may have been practical. Her mother was 97, and a call at that hour carried its own risks. It may have been protective, a choice to let her sleep through the worst of it, to give her one final ordinary hour before the world changed. It may have been both, simultaneously, with the same unsentimental logic that governed everything else the Queen did that night. The note was to be given to the Queen Mother when she woke up. That is how Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon learned Diana was dead. She opened her eyes at Burkhall on the morning of August 31st, 1997, and someone brought her a letter from her daughter. In the main castle, the hours between Diana's death being confirmed and dawn were spent making decisions. Charles wanted to fly immediately to Paris to bring Diana's body home. The Queen initially argued he should stay with the boys. An equerry broke the impasse, according to Mayo's account, with a single question directed at the sovereign. "Would you prefer, ma'am, that the body of the Princess of Wales be brought home in a Herod's van?" The Queen agreed to the flight. A plane would leave from Aberdeen. Charles would be accompanied by Diana's 2 sisters. By 7:15 in the morning, Charles was standing in William's bedroom. "I knew something was wrong," William later recalled. "I kept waking up all night." The prince, 15 years old, was told his mother was dead. Together, he and his father went to Harry's room. Harry was 12. What was said in those rooms exists only in later testimony by the people who were in them. What's known is the sequence. Charles told the boys. Charles told them he had to leave for Paris. The boys would stay at Balmoral with their grandparents. And then came the Queen Mother's recorded response. According to Morton, when Charles left and the boys were to be left in the care of the family at Balmoral, the Queen Mother said, "Thank goodness we're all together. We can look after them." A courtier present described her mood as steely. The word is worth holding for a moment. Steely. Not stricken, not searching. Steely. The natural register of a grandmother learning of her grandchildren's bereavement might begin with sorrow for the boys, with some acknowledgement of the unthinkable thing that had just happened to them. The Queen Mother's register began with logistics and a role to step into. We can look after them. An organizational response to an organizational problem. Some counter-argument requires stating here before the account moves forward. She was 97 years old. A woman in her late 90s who has lived through the things she lived through does not necessarily express shock or grief in the register that younger people recognize as grief. The Queen Mother's generation, born in 1900, adult through both world wars, shaped by loss on a scale most people never encountered, cultivated composure not as a mask, but as a virtue. William Shawcross, in his authorized biography, presents her as a person who genuinely believed that steadiness in the face of catastrophe was both a moral and a practical good. His portrait is structurally favorable, which must be acknowledged, but the psychological consistency it describes is real. Wartime stoicism wasn't performance for her, it was formation. Still, we can look after them isn't the language of grief, it's the language of management. At 11:25 that morning, the royal family arrived at Crathie Kirk. Crathie is a small granite parish church set near the gates of the Balmoral estate, barely large enough to feel grand, its walls the gray of Scottish hillside stone, its interior tight and Presbyterian, and cold in the way of old Scottish churches, regardless of the season. The royal family had attended services there every summer Sunday for decades. The drive from the estate to the church gate takes minutes. On a normal August Sunday, the service was unremarkable, a piece of the routine, an obligation fulfilled quietly. On August 31st, 1997, the whole world was watching. Prince Charles and Prince Philip wore kilts, the estate's traditional Sunday dress for the men. William and Harry were in black ties, their faces flushed, their eyes visible to anyone watching from the roadside as the cars pulled through. Both princes had been awake since their father told them. Harry later wrote in his memoir that as the family passed outside the church, photographers' cameras made a sound he never forgot, an explosion of clicks, and he cursed himself for reaching for his father's hand in that moment, hating that the gesture had been recorded. The boys filed into the church without speaking. So did the Queen. So did the Queen Mother. The visiting preacher that morning was the Reverend Adrian Varwell. According to Mayo's reconstruction, he stuck to his prepared sermon, the sermon he'd written before Diana died, the sermon that had nothing to do with what had happened 8 hours ago in a Paris tunnel. Varwell spoke about the difficulties of moving house. He illustrated his points with jokes attributed to Billy Connolly. The service contained no mention of Diana's death, nothing in the liturgy, nothing in the prayers, nothing from the pulpit, acknowledged that the two princes in the pews had been told that morning that their mother wasn't coming home. The family drove back to the estate afterward. They stopped on the way to view floral tributes that members of the public had left at the roadside, and to greet the small groups who had gathered there. For those few minutes, the family was visible and proximate to ordinary people. Then the cars moved on. Multiple academic papers on the public reaction to Diana's death, published in journals including Anthropology Today and in media studies literature of the period, identify the Crathie Kirk service as the precise moment the public's fury at the monarchy crystallized. into something organized and sustained. The image reached people through morning news broadcasts. The family, in Scotland, at church as normal. No acknowledgement. As if nothing had happened. It was constitutionally defensible. The palace later framed the decision as protection for the princes, an act of familial care. William himself said later that he was grateful for the privacy at Balmoral in those days. Thankfully, we had the privacy to mourn and collect our thoughts. But the institution's internal justification and the public's external perception occupied completely different worlds that morning, and the distance between them was the week's defining problem. The Queen Mother was in that pew. She had made the decision to be there, with everyone else, as the institution chose its frame. Here the account requires a pause to be honest about what it's working with, not as a weakness, but as a structural necessity. The evidence here comes from biographers, and biographers have agendas, access levels, and sourcing chains that aren't equivalent to each other. What follows requires knowing exactly who said what and why. 4 writers produced the most detailed accounts of the Queen Mother's private behavior during September 1997. Tina Brown, Andrew Morton, Sarah Bradford, and William Shawcross. Their access was radically different. Their sympathies were radically different. Where they converge, from different directions, through different routes, the picture becomes most reliable. Tina Brown published The Diana Chronicles in 2007, timed to the 10th anniversary. It runs 524 pages with notes. Brown had been editor of Tatler and Vanity Fair, had sat across from Diana at lunch in Manhattan, and had been thinking about Diana professionally since a 1985 Vanity Fair profile that was among the first to take seriously the idea that Diana was a complicated political actor rather than a royal accessory. The Times review of the Diana Chronicles, written by Sarah Vine, called it the work of a seasoned, serious journalist, not a tabloid product, but something with intellectual architecture. For the Queen Mother specifically, however, Brown's sourcing runs through a single anonymous figure, an exasperated former member of the Queen Mother's staff, named in her acknowledgments, but not identified. One voice, unnamed, with evident sympathies toward Diana's version of events. Andrew Morton's relationship to the material is structurally different and requires its own accounting. His Diana, Her True Story, first published in 1992 and updated after Diana's death, was unique in British royal publishing because it was sourced from Diana's own secretly recorded tape interviews, a fact Morton didn't disclose until Diana was dead. When Morton characterizes the Queen Mother's private attitudes toward Diana during the marriage, he is largely reporting what Diana understood herself to have experienced. The route from the Queen Mother's Burke Hall sitting room to Morton's page runs through Diana's memory, Diana's voice, Diana's emotional framing. That isn't fabrication. Diana was in those rooms, but the filter is real and consequential. Sarah Bradford occupied different ground. Her Elizabeth, a biography of Her Majesty the Queen, and its later updated version, drew on court insiders and took the institution's claims seriously, without simply deferring to them. Bradford is generally considered more sympathetic to the palace's account than Brown or Morton. Her framing of the Diana death week situated the royal family's failure not as coldness, but as a communication gap, a mismatch between the family's genuine grief for the specific person they knew and the public's grief for the icon they had assembled. The Queen, in Bradford's reading, was mourning the flawed woman she'd actually dealt with, rather than the sainted figure the public had created. This framing rehabilitates the family's emotional response, while not quite exonerating their handling of the public crisis. It's a biographer's distinction, and it's Bradford's distinction specifically, from her particular position on the establishment's sympathetic side of the ledger. William Shawcross is the fourth source, and in some ways the most structurally important and the most structurally constrained. He wrote the Queen Mother's authorized biography, published in 2009, commissioned by the royal family with access to the royal archives. His named sources include Sir Michael Oswald, the Queen Mother's racing manager, and Lady Angela Oswald. Real people, named, with documented proximity to Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon for decades. His work is the most factually grounded of the four. It's also structurally inclined toward a favorable portrait of its subject. Authorized biographies work within the boundaries of the archive they're given. What Shawcross documented through those named sources was this. The Queen Mother was hugely upset and felt angry and defensive about the criticism directed at Queen Elizabeth II in the days following Diana's death. She was furious, the Shawcross account makes clear, that her daughter was being attacked by press and public for insufficient mourning. That emotion was real. The sourcing is named. The attribution is clear. This is the highest confidence claim in the entire account. The emotion is directed at the institution's critics, not at Diana's death. Not toward Diana at all. Toward the people attacking the crown. The documented reaction, the best-sourced, most credibly attributed thing anyone said about the Queen Mother's feelings in September 1997, was institutional protectiveness. Fury at siege. Whether she felt private sorrow about Diana, in rooms where no biographer had access, the record can't answer. What the record shows is where her documented attention was focused. Outside the estate walls, a different week was happening. By the morning of September 1st, a queue had formed outside St. James's Palace to sign the condolence book. A signboard, last used for Winston Churchill's death in 1965, was taken from storage. 6 people waited at first. By early afternoon, dozens. By evening, hundreds. By September 2nd, the queue was 7 hours long, 5 abreast in places along the Mall, snaking through streets that had never been built to handle it. At Kensington Palace, the flowers arrived in quantities that defeated any organized response. A single bouquet had been left at the gates in the small hours of August 31st. Within 48 hours, the flowers extended 30 feet from the gate. Teddy bears, photographs cut from magazines, Queen of Hearts playing cards, handwritten notes on notebook paper, on hotel stationery, on the backs of receipts. Someone left a bottle of 1995 Burgundy. Fresh flowers were donated daily and eventually distributed to the sick and the elderly, because the volume had become a logistical problem. By September 10th, the pile near the Kensington Gardens gate measured 5 feet deep in places, and the bottom layer had already begun to compost. Total strangers stood in the queue and wept. Jenny Bond, the BBC's royal correspondent, walked up to a bearded, middle-aged man waiting outside St. James's Palace and asked how long he'd been there. He burst into tears before he could answer. A woman outside Buckingham Palace jabbed a photographer in the ribs. "You killed her." A punk waited in the queue behind a pensioner to lay a wreath. None of this was organized. None of it followed a script. It was a nation processing something that had no precedent in their experience. Inside Buckingham Palace, the daily funeral planning meetings convened each morning in the Chinese drawing room. Alistair Campbell, Blair's press secretary, sat at the table. Representatives of 3 palaces, the church and the Metropolitan Police, sat with him. A speakerphone in the middle of the table connected to Balmoral, where the Queen's deputy private secretary, Robin Janvrin, and Charles's private secretary, Stephen Lamport, participated by voice. They negotiated guest lists, procession routes, the question of who would walk behind the coffin, the scale of the event. All of it discussed down a telephone line while London filled with flowers and the queue outside St. James's hit 7 hours, and the flagpole over Buckingham Palace remained bare. The royal standard flies over Buckingham Palace only when the sovereign is in residence. The Queen was in Scotland. The royal standard never flies at half-mast in any circumstance, because the monarchy has no interregnum. A sovereign dies, and a new sovereign immediately exists. These were constitutional facts, legally sound, procedurally consistent with centuries of precedent, and by the third day of the crisis, completely irrelevant to anyone standing on the Mall looking at the empty pole. An American television morning show raised the question first. The question moved from screen to the crowds at the palace gates and came back amplified. By September 2nd, the bare flagpole was on every front page. Royal biographer Anthony Holden stood in front of the palace explaining the constitutional rationale live on an American breakfast show, while the people surrounding him audibly and repeatedly disagreed with him. His producer spoke in his earpiece. Holden later described the crowd turning on him. The monarchy's procedural explanation and the public's visceral response had stopped occupying the same register entirely. Alistair Campbell's diaries, reviewed in The Guardian, document the sustained government pressure applied throughout the week. Conference calls between Balmoral and Buckingham Palace were, by various accounts, tense and at times openly angry. Blair's government pushed the palace to return to London, to speak publicly, to give the crowd something to hold. A senior aide's description of the royal family's experience at Balmoral during this period, recorded in Morton's account, captures the gap between castle and country with unintended precision. At Balmoral, she hadn't taken it in. You never know what it is like until you are actually there. All the remarks and people hugging each other, sobbing. The whole nation seemed to have gone bananas. The Queen and Prince Philip felt utterly bewildered. Eventually, an alliance of Prince Charles, Tony Blair, and every senior royal advisor converged on a conference call that persuaded the Queen of the scale of what was happening. Once she understood it, everything moved quickly. She returned from Balmoral to London on September 5th. She gave her televised address at 6 p.m. from the Chinese dining room at Buckingham Palace, describing Diana as an exceptional and gifted human being. She walked outside to look at the flowers. She bowed slightly toward the people in the crowds who recognized her. The Washington Post ran the flag story that day. Queen Elizabeth II today ordered the Union Jack to be flown at half-staff over Buckingham Palace on Saturday for the first time. A new permanent precedent, established under the most public possible pressure, 5 days after Diana's death. The Queen Mother's specific position on the flag question isn't documented in any available source. What is documented, through Shawcross, through named sources, is her fury about the criticism her daughter received during those 5 days. Whether she counseled firmness or flexibility on the protocol question, whether she weighed in on it at all, the record does not say. She was 97 years old, at Birkhall, watching from within the estate while history and public relations negotiated each other down a speakerphone. The decision was the Queen's. She made it. The funeral that Diana received on September 6th was built on a plan called Operation Tay Bridge. Operation Tay Bridge was the pre-existing funeral plan for the Queen Mother. It had been rehearsed for 22 years at the point Diana died. Academic sources on the funeral confirm this, including scholarly work on Diana's funeral music and the study More Sign Than Star, Diana, Death, and the Internet. The ceremonial blueprint for Diana's day had been designed and practiced in anticipation of Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's death. When planners needed a framework in September 1997 for a woman who was connected to but no longer formally within the senior royal family, they reached for the nearest available template. It was in a drawer with the Queen Mother's name on it. Getting to that day had required a week of sustained, bitter negotiation between the Spencer household and the Windsor household. Archbishop of Canterbury George Carey described, with visible shock, learning of intense bitterness when he submitted a draft of the service prayers and received back a reaction revealing how completely the two families had stopped talking. The Spencer family had reportedly refused at points to communicate with Buckingham Palace at all. Buckingham Palace pushed back on Spencer's proposed service wording. Disputes emerged over whether the phrase, "People's Princess," would appear in the prayers, with the palace insisting it be removed. The Spencer family considered this outrageous. Prince Charles fought for a public ceremonial funeral against an initial palace preference for something more private. Sir Robert Fellows, the Queen's private secretary and, crucially, the husband of Diana's sister Jane, served as the human bridge between the two families, his double position giving him standing on both sides of a very bitter border. No planning document or account of those negotiations names the Queen Mother as a participant. She was 97. The decisions belonged to the Queen, to Charles, to their advisors. Her funeral plan was the template. She wasn't consulted on how it was being adapted. The morning of September 6, 1997, was overcast over London, the kind of gray that feels specifically English, not storm gray, not the bright white of winter, but the soft, flat gray of a country trying to hold itself together. The tenor bell of Westminster Abbey began tolling at 9:08 a.m. to signal the cortege departing Kensington Palace. 8 members of the Welsh Guards carried Diana's coffin on a gun carriage. The coffin was draped with the royal standard, its ermine border marking it as belonging to the house. On top were 3 wreaths of white flowers, one from Earl Spencer, one from Prince William, one from Prince Harry. Among the arrangements atop the casket was a letter in Harry's handwriting, addressed to Mummy. 3 million people had come to London. They lined the route in relative silence, punctuated at intervals by the sound of someone beginning to cry, and the sound spreading outward through a crowd until it became collective. A wave that rolled through a given block and left it quieter than before. Flowers rained from the crowd onto the cortege as it moved. Vehicles on the opposite carriageway of the M1 motorway pulled over and stopped, miles away, as the procession eventually moved south toward Althorpe. The royal family assembled outside the gates of Buckingham Palace as the coffin approached. The Queen was there. Prince Philip was there. Princess Margaret was there. The Queen Mother was there. All 4 were visible to the cameras. All 4 were visible to the million people lining the mall. As the cortege passed, Queen Elizabeth II bowed her head. Multiple contemporary sources confirm it. The Washington Post's coverage, the BBC broadcast record, contemporaneous newspaper accounts from Britain and internationally. A queen bowing to a woman who had been stripped of her royal title the previous year, who was in no formal sense still a member of the family, whose body was being transported on a ceremonial vehicle built for sovereigns. The bow was deliberate. It was noticed by everyone who watched it. Princess Margaret, standing beside her mother, didn't bow. Andrew Morton's 2022 account records that she stood defiantly upright, looking as though she'd rather be somewhere else. The reason was specific and reported in detail. Shortly after Diana's death, Margaret had been scheduled to fly to Tuscany for her annual August cultural holiday, and she had been, in Morton's telling, deeply irritated at being obliged to stay at Balmoral. That morning, while the family waited outside the palace gates for the cortege, she had reportedly been talking to the Queen about the lavatories at Kensington Palace, complaining about the need for improvements. At the precise moment the coffin passed, the conversation she was choosing to have was about plumbing. The Queen Mother's behavior at that same moment isn't separately described in any available account. She was there. The cameras were there. What she did, whether she bowed, what her face showed, what her eyes did as the coffin carrying the mother of her great-grandsons moved past, the biographers don't isolate. The cameras didn't dwell on her. Inside Westminster Abbey, 2,000 people sat in the space designed for coronations. The ceremony was broadcast in 44 languages. An estimated 2,500,000,000 people watched worldwide. Ken Wharf, Diana's personal protection officer for years, a man with genuine inside access to her world and genuine professional sympathy for her, wrote in Diana Closely Guarded Secret that the Queen, the Duke of Edinburgh, and the Queen Mother sat together in stony-faced silence during the service. This is a single-source characterization from a memoir, from someone whose professional loyalty ran to Diana. That context must be stated plainly. Worf's access was real, and stony-faced silence is a specific behavioral description, not a conclusion about feeling. But he had reasons to describe it the way he did, and those reasons are visible. Earl Spencer's eulogy was the moment the service became something different from a state occasion. He spoke of Diana as the most hunted person of the modern age, a woman given the name of the goddess of hunting who was hunted to death by the press and, by unmistakable implication, by the institution that failed to protect her. He spoke directly about the royal family's approach to raising children, about the boys' souls, about a custody of spirit that he was serving notice would be contested. The speech was accusation delivered as eulogy, and it was executed with complete compositional control. The applause started outside, crowds following on the outdoor screens in Hyde Park and along the route began clapping first, and the sound traveled through Westminster Abbey's stone walls and reached the people sitting inside. The applause rolled through the building. Morton wrote that the Queen stared ahead, stony-faced, as did Prince Philip. Charles was so furious, Morton reported, that aides had to restrain him from issuing a public statement responding to Spencer's remarks. Dicky Arbiter, the former Buckingham Palace press secretary, described the family's mood as very angry and the courtiers as apoplectic, shell-shocked. The Queen Mother sat through all of it. What she thought of the eulogy, what she felt as the applause entered the building, and the institution's worst public moment completed itself in front of 2.5 billion witnesses, the record does not say. The family returned to Balmoral after the burial at Althorpe. Morton preserved a private letter the Queen sent to a close aide, Lady Henriette Abel Smith, written in the immediate aftermath. Emotions still so mixed up, but we have all been through a very bad experience. The architecture of the sentence is revealing. We have all been through, the family as the party that experienced something. Diana's death, in the Queen's private correspondence, rendered as an ordeal undergone, a thing that happened to them. The Queen Mother's equivalent letter, if she wrote one, isn't available in any public record or published biography. The Royal Archives, to which Shawcross had full access as the authorized biographer, yielded no equivalent passage on this specific question, or none he chose to include. His biography documented her fury at the institutional criticism. It didn't document grief for Diana. Before Diana died, the Queen Mother's attitude toward her had been framed most directly by Morton's reporting during the hardest years of the marriage, as Diana's complaints about life inside the royal family accumulated, as her confessional tendencies became more public, as the rift between her and the institution deepened. Morton wrote in Diana, in Pursuit of Love, that those inside the palace circle told each other that she was paranoid, fanciful, or obsessively jealous. The Queen Mother, Morton wrote, dismissed her misgivings as the imaginings of a silly girl. This characterization derives from Diana's own account, filtered through Morton's reporting from Diana's circle. The route it traveled to the page matters. But the quote is specific. The attribution is clear. and it describes a documented private stance held by Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon during the marriage. Charles turned to his grandmother during his marital difficulties. Multiple biographical accounts confirm that during the hardest periods of the Charles-Diana marriage, it was to the Queen Mother that Charles confided. This positioned her as a listener to Charles's account of his wife, not Diana's account of her husband. Whose version of events she was absorbing in the years leading up to August 31st isn't a minor point. Charles told her his side for years. The Queen Mother was aligned, multiple biographical sources suggest, with the institutional view that Diana was the problem, a view reinforced by her closeness to Lady Fermoy, Diana's own grandmother, who reached the same conclusion. One unnamed equerry, cited in a Grazia Daily account, described the Queen Mother as having refused to let Diana's name be mentioned in public after the princess and Charles separated. The temporal framing of that account is ambiguous. It appears to reference the separation period from 1992 onward, not necessarily the post-funeral years. The source is unnamed, and the account is secondary. But it describes an active posture, a refusal, a directive, which is different in kind from simple absence. In the 5 years between September 1997 and March 2002, the Queen Mother's health declined significantly. Her last major public engagement was the recommissioning of HMS Ark Royal on November 22, 2001. She was bedridden through long stretches of 2001 and 2002. The declining public appearances mean fewer opportunities to name anyone in those years. The silence in the record about Diana could reflect a woman with a shrinking platform. It could reflect a deliberate choice. The record can't distinguish between those two explanations. What the record shows is the silence itself. No documented public appearance between September 1997 and March 2002. No interview, no speech, no walkabout, no formal occasion in any account available in the research for this story contains a recorded reference to Diana. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, died on March 30, 2002, at Royal Lodge, Windsor, at 3:15 in the afternoon. She was 101. Queen Elizabeth II was by her side. Her death set in motion Operation Tay Bridge. The plan built around her, adapted for Diana 5 years earlier, now finally deployed for its intended subject. The tenor bell of Westminster Abbey sounded 101 times that morning, one for each year. 200,000 people filed past her, lying in state over 3 days, the queue stretching more than a mile along the Thames. Her funeral on April 9, 2002, drew crowds that lined the streets as the gun carriage moved through London. The same ceremonial architecture, the same Westminster framework, the same formal structure that Diana had received first. The plan had been rehearsed for 22 years. It was built for her. It was borrowed for Diana in 1997. In 2002, it ran for the woman it had always been intended for. No tribute delivered at her funeral, and no major obituary published in the days that followed her death, records any statement she made about Diana in the 5 years between the funeral and her own death. The Guardian's coverage of the Queen Mother's funeral contains no mention of Diana. The tributes from family, friends, and colleagues who spoke publicly about Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in those days don't reference Diana. The silence in the record is complete. The Queen Mother lived for 5 more years after Diana's funeral. In all that time, 5 years, hundreds of public appearances, she reportedly never once mentioned Diana by name in public. Some silences are louder than speeches. Subscribe for more stories like this.